Hello, everyone. It is delightful to have you all here, along with our three esteemed speakers. I hope all or most of you could hear all three of their talks. We want to have a little bit of a panel discussion here because so many different issues were being raised. Can you all hear me all right? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Katerina Manchanda, the curator of modern and contemporary art here at the Seattle Art Museum. And I was debating this entire time, should we bring our seats up a little so we can see each other better? Whether to start with, one of those more general questions or something more specific. And I tend to go towards the specific, perhaps especially due to Vanja's talk, and then kind of work our way up into different territory. So thought-provoking, your entire lecture on the important scientific discoveries and theorems of the early 20th century, notably Einstein's theory of relativity and how it impacted so much of the thinking, and especially with respect to Calder. And in an earlier essay by you, you quote from one of Calder's 1943 manuscripts where he writes, apropos of measuring a mobile, and he says, I say nuclei, for me, whatever sphere or other form are using these constructions does not necessarily mean a body of that size, shape, or color, but may mean a more minute system of bodies, an atmospheric condition, or even a void, i.e. the idea that one can compose anything of which he can conceive, end of quote. And that made me wonder, and I want to kind of pose this question to the panelists here, do you think we could, with that, think of Alexander Calder's mobiles in particular, or stabiles and mobile components, as models of thinking? I mean, not literally as a maquette to be translated. I'm trying to get at, the distinction between, you try to bring this out, what is real, yet also needs to be imagined because it's not part of our visual field. I wondered on your thoughts about that.
Well, I can start. No, absolutely. I think this science and so I spent a lot of my time reading period material, right? So there's things I didn't even have a moment to cover in this talk, trying to wrap it up. But there was authors like James Jeans and Arthur Eddington who were writing these really science-heavy book about the new world, astronomy. Physics and astronomy went hand in hand at this moment. And were speaking and writing in a very visual way. And I picked up the books, and they were, read about how they were bestsellers and outsold the Bible. And I was like, what is this going to be like? And I started reading it, and it's immersive. And it really turns on your creativity and makes you start thinking about things and start thinking about relationships as spaces. How can there be a space that's warped? We haven't experienced that, and it's in our universe. We live in this universe, but we don't experience it that way. Time that could be dilated, and again, we don't experience it, but it exists in the same moment we're existing. So I think, for an artist to try to conceptualize and to think of those things, art is a way to do that, to try to think through these relationships, think through what it could be and what is that we can't see, that we don't have access to. So I don't think at any moment Calder's trying to replicate, but I think he's realizing that things exist in our moment that the same moment as us that we don't have access to, but we know it's more than what we see. And I think that's a great source of inspiration for an artist in this moment.
Interesting. Anyone else?
I think there's a danger that we all, as people who think of, as intellectuals who think about the arts, I think there's always a danger in turning a work of art into a manifesto or into a theory or into an idea. Great works of art are full of ideas and theories and visions and viewpoints. But a work of visual art, for my money, has to have a freestanding life, a life of its own, an actuality that it is beyond all these things that may flow into it. You know, one of the things I was thinking about during your talks, there are a lot of artists in the mid-20th century who are very, very interested in science, people like Gorgi Kepish, you mentioned Malloy. To my mind, their work, certainly in comparison to Calder's, fails in large part, because it remains an illustration of a scientific or theory or idea. All of this stuff flows into Calder's art, but what Calder, I think, is ultimately creating is, as he would call it, an object that has this mesmerizing, freestanding value that you can't ever reduce to any of these other things. So for me, and again, I would say this about any works of art at any time or place. I think, you know, you could talk about Michelangelo's theories, his ideas about the Christian universe as it's realized in the Sistine Chapel. Leo Steinberg has written marvelously about those ideas, his particular theological ideas. But all of that may be true, but the Sistine Chapel has a freestanding value. It has a meaning that can't be broken up or separated into these this bit of theory, that bit of philosophy. And I think that's part of what's so glorious about Calder, that he takes all of these things and then he makes something with them that is some way inextricable. It just is what it is. And you look at it and there it is. It can't be broken down into its constituent parts, even though it's fascinating to think about the constituent parts.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that the individual objects, you know, encapsulate a theory, but I was more thinking about the model character when he says, you know, don't take this literally, don't take one thing as just that one thing. But it's interesting to hear your thoughts on making sure we don't limit things, but rather see the work in and of itself there.
I just wanted to add, in terms of thinking about Calder's initial discussions of his abstraction, which was brought up by Vanja, that Calder is looking for a way to convey what he is assembling, imagining, and setting into a composition as a complete work. And he's utilizing that kind of terminology. He's tapping into that. So it obviously plays into his understanding of reality. And then the reality of the object, as Jed says, is looking to create a certain presence that keys to a perception and awareness of this larger realm.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Something else I found intriguing, actually carried through in different ways in all three of your presentations. And Beth, I love the structure in which you kind of looked at his different stays in Paris and coming back, and then in each time he comes back to Paris kind of with the knowledge gained up to this point, but perhaps also thinking of how to position himself differently. And what stood out to me, Jed, it started with you, and Vanja, you ended with that page, I think it was from the retrospective catalog, of that mobile photographed by, was it Matter, in those different types of configurations. Beth, you were illustrating with the different film clicks also how the early wire sculptures, how they were animated and how they were moving. So this idea of dematerialization, maybe that's a too contemporary term. I think you used vaporization. But I was also wondering if there was ever thought or commentary of this sense of energetic, and of course we have man-raised, solarized photographs which are swimming somewhere in the background, but on the one hand, thoughts and meaning on the connection of light or energy on the one hand, and on the other hand, any, I don't want to say alignments, but thoughts on film, which of course was also a radical medium in the 1920s. Is there anything we should know about?
I mean, you know, one of the interesting things about Calder is he's living in this time of astonishing technological advances, plastics, film. And one of the things that's interesting about Calder is the extent to which he doesn't embrace new media, the extent to which, I suppose, found myself thinking the many years I worked in the biography, like, why doesn't he get interested in doing his own photography? Why isn't he interested in film? In some way, in the midst of all these extraordinary scientific and technological revelations, he remains a kind of old-fashioned artisan with his pieces of metal and his hammer, and the tools he uses are very much 19th century or earlier century tools. And I think that's frankly part of the power of his work and his imagination, that he absorbs all this extraordinary stuff, new stuff, but he wants to realize it in a way, very basic, plain-spoken language of materiality. So I think there is that tension in his work, and I do think it's part of the power of the work.
I have a question. What do you think Calder is learning by looking at, let's say, Matter's photographs, and that quote from the 40s about the mobile having a wake?
I mean, one of the ironies of the Matter photographs, which we both use them, when you actually watch a mobile, it doesn't look like that. Okay,
but he calls it an invisible wake.
You don't.
So
I think
so you can't see it with your naked eye,
right,
but the photographs show it.
But I think one of the reasons the Matter photographs interested him is the fact of the matter is, when you see mobiles in museums and galleries, you really don't see a lot of what they do. And I have to say that in my many years of working on Calder and being in places where mobiles were allowed to move freely, one of the things I began to realize is how differently different mobiles move. I mean, for instance, in your gamma that you have upstairs, if you notice some of the mobiles upstairs, some of the elements will be vertical and some are horizontal. And if you actually see these mobiles moving in wind, those elements move differently. So there is, in fact, a whole range of different kinds of kinetic things that happen. Some mobiles move very smoothly horizontally. Some go like this. Some of the big ones, like that later very big thing you have, when wind goes, they go like they whirl, like powerfully. And I think one of the things that Calder liked about the Matter photographs was that they gave people who did not have the opportunity a sense of that. I mean, Calder, a lot of these mobiles were made for, relatively well-to-do people. I mean, there was a time in the 40s, if you were a successful doctor or lawyer in New York City, you could go into the Kurt Valentin Gallery and buy a mobile and hang it in your house. And your kid would knock against it and it would do this, and then the wind would go and it would do this. And so you experienced all these different kinetic qualities, which it's just very hard to know about today.
So in answer to your question about film, I was always, and this is something I haven't thought about in years, but I know he did partner with John Cage to create a film of his work. And I thought it was really interesting reading the correspondence that he waited.
You mean with it's a Herbert matter?
But he participated in it.
Yes.
And I remember reading that he waited, I forget, it was at a year or something, for Cage to be available. And Cage took audio of the sounds of his films in his workshop, where how they were banging around at each other, and like used it in a really interesting way. So I think, in that way, I do see him participating in this kind of, I do see him pushing boundaries, not only in kind of thinking about what that could look like and how his work can be in a film, but also I think it's really noteworthy. He was the first artist to design the BMW Arts car. He did the airplane. He really did push boundaries in thinking about his art. And so in that way, I think he was very much also of his time.
That's really fascinating. I want to get back to, and this was, I think, also one of the questions came up by one of our visitors. We have a stack of questions here we'll get to later on too. But this idea of kind of distinctive moments in which he's kind of reinventing himself or changing, developing a new outlook. I guess you all described kind of the inflection point between the circus and the wire sculptures to the first hand-operated abstract pieces after the visit to Mondrian's studio, but then also later on, after World War II, working on a very different scale. Are there other key moments, perhaps especially when one is thinking of him? Of course, he works not only in one medium, he goes back and forth. I think we need to emphasize that as well. But are there other key events that that kind of allowed him to grow later on in his career?
Well, one thing I don't know if we've talked about at all, I do think the Depression, the coming of the Depression in 1930, has something to do, is in the background, but very powerfully in the background of the shift to abstraction. Because when you think about the wire sculptures of the 20s, of acrobats, of the great Josephine Baker, to me, those sculptures, the great wire sculptures, they're part of the kind of champagne high of the 20s, along with some of the Fitzgerald novels. They represent that period, and I think Calder knew that he couldn't, if he'd gone on doing wire sculptures of dancers and things like that in the 1930s, it would have been anomalous. And I do think that the shift is in some way a response to a shifting world. And the gravitas of the early abstractions, which are very, very austere, I think is connected with the shifting mood of that period. Now then, at the end of his life, in the 70s, he in a sense returns to some of the ebullience of the, he does figures again, these wacky figures of women with 3 legs and high heels, which are really, really marvelous. And in fact, a good friend of his, writing about those, connected them to sort of the spirit of the 60s and the student revolts and stuff. And I think there's, I mean, like all profound artists, it's not like he's saying, "Oh, this is the way the world is today. I'll do this," but he's in a dialogue with the wider world.
Well, I just want to get to also just to thinking about the intermedial question, like working in different media and what is the relationship between them. Don't you believe that Calder is at certain points switching dimensions? I mean, literally from a planar surface to a 3-dimensional, and then into this idea of movement. So thinking about what is the media that's getting him thinking about that visualization, whether it's through a drawing or whether it's through manipulation or cutting of metal and attaching it and setting it up in space. I just wonder what is the relationship between his thought process between those dimensions, and as he switches dimensions, how he's able to visualize, his whole process of visualization. One example, what about the gouacherie late in life, you know? And how he's working it out with gouache.
We should explain what that is. When he and his wife ended up living in a village, Sachet, in the Loire Valley, basically starting in the mid-50s, and in the later 60s and 70s, they lived there, much of the year. They would come to America for a few months. And he had a number of studios there. He had a studio where he did sculpture, and then there was a little kind of cottage where he called it his gouacherie, where he worked with gouache, which is those, you know, the opaque but water-based medium that you do work on paper with. And he would kind of go back and forth, actually, during a day. So he'd go work on something in 3 dimensions, and then kind of walk over the gouacherie, which was a minute or 2 walk away, and paint these paintings on paper. I mean, my feeling has always been that that in many cases the works on paper were a way of just letting everything hang out, and he would do crazy, wacky things. There's a series about card players, actually, which now there's a deck of cards, which is actually on sale in the bookstore here, with elements from those card players. He did, I think aren't there scenes of a dentist, I mean, like doctor's offices? I mean, he would just do crazy stuff because he was like in his head, and a lot of it is stuff that, at least for the moment, he felt it was too wacky, too nutty, too eccentric to go into a sculpture, and certainly into a large sculpture. Though I think some of the wacky ideas from the gouaches, then like a few years later, like he'll start doing, in the later years, these standing mobiles with bases which are sort of half animal. And I think some of that comes from playing around with the gouache. But of course, this is a very common kind of artistic process where you know, sketching, studying, playing around is a way of kind of sifting through your ideas, and then deciding on the ones that you want to push to a kind of more focused or expanded version.
Well, in answer to respond to that, but also in answer to the question, like one of the things I thought a lot about, and I remember reading your essay from a while back about Calder and play and even play psychology and Winnicott, was thinking, how do you connect the circus to his abstract work? And, you know, ultimately, you know, only Calder can answer that question. But I think one of the things that has come to my mind after getting to know his work and thinking a lot about it is play forces you, especially if you're thinking about play psychology and like the science of it, it's a imaginary realm, right, where no reality really will restrict you in any way, where you can do anything, and so anything is possible in the realm of play. And I think in some ways too, this new vision of what the universe is was showing that all of these restrictions we had in our mind of what it was weren't there, or were not the same way. And it also was this imaginary space you began to imagine and think what it could be. And in that way, I found that in my mind, I saw a parallel there. I saw both had this invitation for creative thought of what is beyond, like without the restrictions of what we see is possible in our lives.
Interesting, yeah. I was curious, by the way, how both of, well, the other panelists were feeling about Beth's hypothesis of Calder presenting himself as this American inventor to Parisian audiences, and whether this kind of embrace of the new and wanting to be part and shape a new art that kind of has this radical break with the past. Jed, you kind of skipped yesterday very quickly in order to get to the more historical traditions over the amazing and of course widely accepted fact that part of his genius is to take away everything we associate with sculpture up to a point, the heaviness, the standing still, being on a pedestal, something that's agile and movable, something that had never been done before in such a way. So this idea of the inventor, which you posit, Beth, I wonder how the other panelists were kind of responding to this idea as the way in which he's kind of presenting himself to Parisian audiences.
Well, I mean, I think Beth's story is part of, in a way, the larger story of Paris. Remember, Paris was an international city in those years, and you think of the artists. Picasso is Spanish. Picasso, Miro called is very close to Spanish. There were Spaniards. Mondrian is Dutch. There are Russians. There are Italian. Calder lived with in the years around 1930. He's living this little sort of street alley called the Villa Brune. Campilli is one of the people there who's Italian, and I think what you're talking about presenting oneself as American people. These artists, they felt like they were part of a kind of international fraternity. At the same time that they felt like they were universal, but they were also very particular to where they came from. I mean, people were talking about Picasso's connection to Spanish art, to El Greco, in 1905, 1907. So I think the story Beth is telling is part of this a very expansive story of modernism. I mean, one of these things I realized about Calder and the Calder's wife, who he meets as you said, on a boat going back to America, she had spent time in Paris as a kid, okay, and her French was always much better than his, actually, and they of course end up then spending their life going back and forth, but they were part of a world of people who did that. We think of globalism as a sort of discovery of recent decades, but when you read about these people, they felt very much that they were Americans, but they were also part of this international community, creative, intellectual, artistic community. So you came with sort of your American inventor stuff, but then you met people who came with other, the Dutch came with Mondrian with a sort of Dutch austere, Protestant austere thing, and the Russians had their romantic, whatever thing. I mean, everybody had these kind of things that they brought, and it was this great mix of stuff.
Although I think, Beth, you were also trying to convey a sense of the mystique of America from a European vantage point.
Well, that's the thing. There was a lot of back and forth in terms of, are you buying this stereotype or are you not buying this stereotype? Am I going to poke fun at this kind of nationalism, or am I going to proceed? And I think the artists saw this, as you say, they saw themselves as this kind of confraternity pursuing their own ideas about expression, but they used these stereotypes. They used these images to begin to talk about the tenor of the times, and the tenor of the times in the 1920s was extremely nationalistic, and the idea of for example, Gerald Murphy's Within the Quote, it was all about that 1924 immigration law, the first big restriction put on American immigration. And so then what are they doing with that? Well, they're going to play that with the stereotypes from movies, and they're going to, in some ways, mock this very superficial understanding of what America is and whether America is really all what it is supposed to be cracked up to be. But at the same time, it gave them freedom from to be out from under the expectations that you were supposed to somehow fit with this movement or that movement.
Yeah, so that, I think, answers also one of the questions that came from the audience, why he rejected the label of or affiliation with the surrealists or the cubists. And it's, I think, as you were just saying, perhaps the sense of wanting to be free to define a new universe onto his own liking.
I mean, you really cannot underestimate the cosmopolitanism of Calder and his wife. I mean, when they're back in America in the early 40s, even during the war, they start to build these connections with artists and architects in South and Central America and Mexico, and people are coming to America, and then after the war, the Calders, both Sandy and his wife Louisa, fall in love with Brazil and Brazilian culture, and of course a lot of the creative people in South America, it's true of Venezuela, a lot of them have trained in France. I mean, have gone to art schools and stuff in France, and French is of course a kind of a connection, but the Calders are constantly so interested in expanding those kind of connections. Again, feeling passionately American. I mean, and of course, then in the late '60s, they get very involved in the movement to reduce nuclear proliferation and the anti-war movement. They're passionately engaged with American politics. But at the same time, they have this vision, which connects also with Vanja's idea of this sort of seeing the world in new, expanding ways. I mean, I mentioned, last night, just in brief, I ended up actually talking to an Indian artist named Kahana, well-known Indian painter, who was in his 90s when I spoke to him a couple of years ago, who Calder had this very intensive encounter with when Calder was in India in the 50s. I mean, the Calder and his wife, they hungered to meet new people, artists coming from different places, part of this vision of a community that was global, which did not erase your localism. So you were both. You know, it's sometimes people will say, "Oh, is Calder American or French?" You know, they don't. Well, he's
a citizen of the world.
Right, he's a citizen of the world.
Now, I was thinking in your talk last night, Jed, when you showed that, was it an Indian or Pakistani relief panel?
Was that in Madras? Was that the big stone carving with the Ganges in the middle?
From the Ganges. It made me think about that trip to India. And it also reminded me of Noguchi's trip to India and his interest in astronomical.
Right, yes, right, which Calder went to see.
Yes, they both saw that observatory.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say also for surrealism, as someone who studied a lot of surrealism, that Breton had a reputation. I feel like, these artists knew each other, and a lot of people, I think even Moreau had said to Calder, like, I wish I never had signed. So, because then there was this pressure of conforming, once you were a part of this group, and there was like a, very much a pressure. The surrealists have to operate in this way. So I think Calder was very wise to steer clear of that. I mean, he was part of the abstraction creation group, which seemed it was a much more positive experience before him. What's that?
Wasn't that the only group that he signed on to?
Well, I mean, he participated in the Dimensionist Manifesto, but that died. So, I mean, the story of the Dimensionist Manifesto is all these artists who were collecting in the Dome Cafe, and Calder was representing New York. He was like the U.S. Connecticut, a U.S. artist, but it was one of those that they had ambitions, and I went through the archive and was reading about it, and they had planned to do a big show in New York, and Calder would be the main person for that, and then they'd have a show in all different parts of the world, or as they imagined it through their participants, and of course, the world had different plans for them with the World War, and so it kind of fizzled and died, and it didn't come to realization. So I would say that it's not that he didn't want to participate with a group. It was just he seemed willing when it wasn't that there was this strict idea being imposed on him of what his art had to be or conform to. I also think it was really interesting to see this manifesto of how he was the American representative in this international context of what was happening and how artists were responding. When I was doing my PhD on Calder, there has been research about the influence of science on art, and it tends to center on Paris, and it tends to center on European artists. And I was kind of like, were American artists just didn't know what was going on? Like, why are they not part of this conversation? Why is no one talking about America? And then, I stumbled upon Calder and his own writing, and of course he was part of this conversation. That hasn't been the story that was told about him. And in fact, if you look at the Dimensionism book, he wasn't the only one either. This is an idea that, Noguchi, we talk about him. There is a work I included in my show which he titled E = MC squared. I mean, that's not an accident. That was his friend. And they did even the circus. He sometimes played the music for Calder. So, I mean, this was a larger conversation that was of that moment. And I think Calder was happy to represent the U.S. in that context in Paris.
In connection with the question of isms, I mean, to turn to politics, it's fascinating to think of Calder in relation to the radical politics of the 1930s, because he never felt the pull of Marxism or the Communist Party, which many artists, many people he was close to did, at least for a time. His friend, the great literary critic, Malcolm Cowley, said in something he wrote after Calder's death, he said that Calder was sort of a Jeffersonian spirit. I mean, he sort of believed in a kind of Jeffersonian democracy, and I think there was an aspect of Calder that was, again, with Marxist ideas as with Surrealist ideas. He was in the room when all this stuff was discussed, but as I think you said, he had this kind of instinct for preserving who he was in all its kind of quirky complexity, and not wanting to get ismed in this direction or that direction.
I was actually glad, Jed and Beth, that you are both stressing the cosmopolitan aspect of Paris, in the 20s and 30s in particular, and also this kind of much larger international worldview, which I feel gained new currency or a renewed currency after World War II because of the calamity of what the various nationalisms had kind of, the devastation the war had wrought and everything. And it brings me to one of the questions by one of our viewers and listeners, namely about the reception of Calder's work in the art world. Was he discussed seriously early on, or when is it, at what point is he acknowledged as a master? And or how is he perhaps being cast? I mean, is it after World War II that people really celebrate him as an international spirit or as a distinctly American artist?
43. In 43, he has a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he himself wrote to Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, years later, when Barr was retiring, and he said, Calder said to Barr, you that show that you guys did in 43, that's the thing, that was the turning point. But of course that was during the war, and the art market even after the war was slow to pick up. Interestingly, he's starting to make significant sales in the 50s. I mean, first of all, I have to say, fame and money are not the same thing.
They're not the same.
In the arts, okay? I mean, Calder was very well known in the 40s, but in the late 40s, there were months when he would write to his dealer and say, can you send us $100? Because we have some bills to pay and we have no money, okay? One of the interesting things that happens starting in the 50s, he and Louisa, his wife, really want to start living more in Europe again, but he's very worried about what that will do to his reputation. But what happens after the war is the new generation in America, the abstract expressionist generation, which is younger than him, there's a lot of focus on them in America right after the war. Their Pollock, de Kooning, they skyrocket. In Europe, there's a lot of renewed interest in just the stuff that Vanja, you and Beth have been. There's a lot of renewed interest in Dadaism and in the abstraction of the early 30s. And Calder kind of gets caught up in that. And some of the really important shows about movement and about the early history of movement in modern art take place not in America, but in France and Holland, starting in the 50s.
Well, the kinetic art movement.
Right, the kinetic art
Duchamp
movement.
and Calder were considered the old masters
Exactly.
of movement.
And then, and even the Meg Gallery, there are galleries in Paris that sort of are ballooning after the war. So, and Europe is also more responsive to the monumental sculptures. Spoleto is one of the first ones. Before, in America, that sort of takes off in the later 60s. So, although when he starts living more in France in the mid-50s, he's worried about what it's going to mean economically. It's actually, there's, as Beth said, among younger artists and curators, there's this incredible surge of interest in kind of picking up where the European avant-garde left off in the 30s. I mean, his friend, this wonderful Italian critic and curator, Carandente, when Calder first meets him, Carandente, I think, has done the first Mondrian show in Rome at that point in the 50s. So there's all this excitement about all the stuff Calder was into in the 30s. So actually, Europe becomes very, very important for him in the 50s and 60s.
But I want to push back a little bit about this international Calder and say that Calder was international. I mean, he was looking, and remember, the futurists were the ones that really showed the modern art world how to make that circuit, how to create and project an identity through traveling exhibitions. And when you look at the list of places where Calder is exhibiting, and before World War II, you look at the 30s, I mean, it's unbelievable where what shows he's in and where he's going. And then after the war, he sets out, and it's almost like, how many continents can I land on?
Well, as demonstrated by all of your slides in your various presentations, I'd like to get back to the art one more time, and perhaps also to the later art. Beth, I think you showed this wonderful drawing, which I'd never seen before, the sketch for an idea of a viewer perhaps manipulating one of those earlier constructions, or was it you, Jed? I can't remember. One of you showed that.
You showed the,
What did I do?
Well, maybe both of you. I can't remember. So I
The
just
Mary
want,
Can?
yeah, so kind of this interactive aspect. And I was
it's the letter to
thinking,
Sweeney. That's right.
also, Jed, in your talk last night about his responsiveness to architectural space for these much, much larger monumental sculptures, and this fascinating relationship that you point out to kind of his father and grandfather essentially making a sculpture for a public sphere. And I was wondering to myself, what he's really doing, was it Pink Flamingo? Is that the piece in Chicago?
Flamingo, it's called. It's called Flamingo.
Sorry, Flamingo.
Flamingo.
Sorry, it's red. It's not pink, but just
Pink
Flamingo.
Flamingo is a midnight movie.
Yeah, well, sorry about that. But I asked myself, you know, in front of these austere Mies van der Rohe buildings, they feel like such a radical intervention. I mean, they invite people to walk through there. I mean, can we think of his sculptures as, you know, activating a public space? Would that be an appropriate way of thinking about that?
I mean, in Chicago, I think that's totally what happened. I mean, and I think it is a perfect, I mean, one of the marvelous things is the Mies van der Rohe are one, they're each, you know, it's the very low one, the very high one. One of the high ones is a very dense volume, one is less dense. And of course, it's also in the midst, I mean, it's in the midst of that incredible downtown, you know, the Loop area with all this amazing circa, you know, 1880s, 1890s, the classic Chicago architecture. So in the midst of that, there's this masterwork by Mies van der Rohe. In the midst of that, there's this Calder that goes into dialogue with it. And I mean, the analogy to Rome to something like, to the Piazza Navona really holds, because again, it's that the architect artists, they're not doing it themselves. They have been granted this social space in the city that has evolved over a long period of time, and they're, in a way, they're riffing on a social universe that already exists that they then bring their own personality and vision to.
And there's an element of experiential to his work that is true of the public works where, you know, you're invited to walk, you're the one moving, not the sculpture, but you're moving through it, and every frame you see, every angle for how you turn is always different because everything around you, there's people, there's things happening, and so it's kind of like the Mobile. It's never the same. It's very experiential in that way, and that's a parallel I see between his Mobile sculptures and the Stabiles. So I think in that way, you know, I don't know. I really enjoy like getting to experience the works, and I'm always struck by how they frame the space around you, and you see this space in a new way.
I just wanted to, and I was mentioning this to Jed last night, about the severity of Mies van der Rohe and the grid, and the fact that the lines of the grid of Mies architecture, you know, is down to the sidewalk. It follows each pier sets up the grid for that plaza. I mean, all the lines in the concrete. And so entering into that and using the same material, steel, you know, that Mies has made this building out of, but making it bend, animating it, painting it red. It is energizing and entering into that space in a way that gives the pedestrian permission to become part of that conversation.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point, Beth. And I mean, growing up in Europe where, you know, I would encounter Calder perhaps first through public spaces because so many of his sculptures are in public spaces. They often function as a signal, as a meeting point, as a gathering point, a little bit like the sun in the solar system, right, that draws everybody around them. By the way, one of the questions we got from one of you here was how the architects, perhaps like Mies van der Rohe, may have felt of having such a bold sculpture installed in front of their buildings. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Calder, Mies van der Rohe was dead, had already died. He died. That was a
That's
plan.
An easy one to work with.
What?
Easy one to work with then.
Well, no, though, but Calder had been trying to work with Mies for decades. He had, when I believe when Mies first came to America in the 30s, I think there's some post-Calder trying to get involved with him. I mean, Calder, I mentioned this yesterday, Calder loved architects. He was very good friends with Alvar Aalto, and there was a beautiful Calder mobile in the Villa, I don't know how you exactly pronounce it, Meri, the famous, one of the great, enormous Aalto houses in Finland. And he loved the idea of working with architects. He wanted to do something for Brasilia in Brazil, which he made maquettes, but it didn't work out. It's very difficult to get the right, you know, for all the planets to converge, for an artist and architect to find a way to work together. More often than not, it doesn't quite succeed.
Yeah, there was one question. You all know Mountains, which the Shirley acquired for the museum a couple of years ago. Incredible work, and you all know it's a maquette for the enormous Mountains and Clouds that's in the Hart Senate building in Washington, D.C. So one of the our visitors is wondering what the current status is for the effort to get the cloud reinstalled. And Kim is laughing. I don't know, Kim and John, maybe you have more insights in terms of where that process is right now, but maybe one of you have insights too. Or Beryl, I don't know. Yeah.
This is such an important thing.
Yeah, come on up, I'll give you the mic.
or sit here?
I'll stand. This is a project that is very close to Kim and my heart. So I first saw that work at the Heart Center office building many, many years ago. It turns out that Kim's first job after leaving Wellesley was to go to Washington, D.C. and work in the Heart Center office building prior to when it was installed. So it came in about a year or two after you left. Remember, this was done, completed 10 years after Calder passed away, even though it was all designed, all ready to go. Then he passed away, and this created this sort of gap in time. I took Kim there on a trip and said, we're going to go in and see the most amazing Calder ever. And by that time, the clouds had been taken down and destroyed. And so there was this 60-foot-high mobile inside the atrium of the Senate office building, and up above, where there's supposed to be these 4 gigantic mobiles. Remember, this is the largest and the only it's the only work he ever did that had a stable mobile combination, and it was the largest, certainly the largest mobile he had ever done. And it wasn't gone, because after the earthquake in D.C. that damaged the Washington Monument was damaged, and it was scaffolded. That also caused this Calder to drop a little bit. They went up, they inspected it, it hadn't been made correctly, and so it was taken down and destroyed. So at that point, I got in touch with Sandy Rower, who runs the Calder Foundation and is a grandson of Alexander Calder, and said, what can we do to put this back? And he thought, wow, I've got a sucker here. Someone who really wants to do this and maybe can help me afford to do it. So we have been working the halls of Congress, specifically a number of senators, for over 8 years, and dealing with an architect of the Capitol who retired, and then another appointee came in by our beloved ex-president, who turned out to be a very, very bad man and was fired. And so we've had a lot of difficulty in moving it through. Anyway, we have, after these 8 years, we now have permission to create a public fundraising effort. The money will go to the Calder Foundation, and we have a fabricator. Yet this is not public announced yet, but we believe we'll get the contract for this because it's still a process going forward. And it's our hope that in the next, within a couple of years, we'll be able to put the whole thing back up there where it belongs. It's a project that is sort of co-managed by the Calder Foundation, but also by the federal government, which has a great deal of say in this, and so that makes it go extremely slowly. But we hope that all of the stars will align, and sometime in about 2 years we'll be able to have it reinstalled. So, and that will be. And by the way, thank you. And that was the last work he ever did. That was his last piece of work.
Thank you so much for joining us on stage. That is the absolute most recent. How very exciting. If we have a little more time, one question was brought to us that's really quite apropos, and that is, to the three of you, what inspired you to kind of delve into scholarship on Calder in the first place? And I'm sure these are very different motivations for all of you. Jed obviously spent 12 years researching the incredible biography, but I know all of you have amazing stories. For you, it was the beginning of your dissertation. Beth, you've been working on Calder for such a long time. Who wants to start?
Oh.
Beth, maybe you should start.
Claim the first inspiration. I never met Calder. But I came across his work as I began writing my dissertation on American artists in Paris. And as I learned the stories literally of hundreds of Americans. And I literally counted the number of Americans that were in the salons. I created this chapter in American art history where previously people really weren't paying attention to the visual arts in the 20s. They were looking more to the literary history and saying that, what was really happening in America you should look at New York in the 1920s. But what I discovered was that there were just droves of Americans. So amongst the many was the story of Alexander Calder. And what is phenomenal to me was his awareness of that moment, that he could somehow, speaking of visualizing large systems, understanding, comprehending really what was going on. And he could see that there was this broad and large connection between Europe and America. And he also saw a way to be in dialogue with both on the transatlantic. And let me tell you, the history of American art does not have many artists that can tell that story. And so I just became totally enthralled with his abilities. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. So that's how I got started.
I guess I sort of fell into it.
I've always talk about the conference that I invited you to. Do you remember that?
I do, but
I
always loved Calder, and I write different kinds of books, and I'd never written a biography. I always thought that Calder would be a wonderful person to write a biography of, and then one thing led to another, and I did it. He's a wonderful subject for a biography because, as you're saying, it is such a rich life with so many dimensions and so many friendships.
Yes.
Frankly, there are a lot of artists I adore who I don't think would necessarily be the best subjects for an extended biographical treatment, because a lot of wonderful artists sort of are very solitary. They stay in one place. They may not even know that many people. But Calder's extraordinary achievement is created, is realized against this tapestry, which, as you said, is much of the 20th century really. In the transatlantic world.
As if the world was his oyster.
Yes, yes.
To me, he had this kind of confidence
Yeah.
to enter in, and he was very social, and to him, knowledge was social. The whole conversation, that grew out
Absolutely,
of
yes,
the ideas of a given.
And he found in Louisa James a partner who, again, also came from a family. She lived in Europe as a child. Her parents were complicated, interesting people, and they together forged an amazing life across the Atlantic. Really.
What about you, Vanja?
So I actually started on Calder by working on another artist. I was writing my master's on another American sculptor and doing an internship, actually doing art conservation in New York City with citywide monuments. And they took us to Storm King, a sculpture garden. And I came across Calder's work and I was like, who is this artist? And I knew of Calder, but I hadn't seen that scale of work of his. And I started just doing some work, and I went to my advisor and was like, I'm changing my topic. And she's like, that's a terrible idea. Don't do it. You're almost done with your master's. I'm like, no, I really want to work on this artist. And part of it was because I came across a lot of the statements I read to you all, and I was like, what does he mean by that? And I started digging and trying to understand this larger context. And what I love about art history and research in art history is you never know what rabbit hole it's going to take you down. You never know. I never knew I'd be ordering books on Amazon about what people were reading in the 1920s about modern science. Like, I never knew I would be looking at play psychology. I never knew, like, so much about, like, even revisiting sites of, like, what Calder went to see. And I felt there was so much wealth there, and it really opened up a new appreciation for me, not just of Calder, but of that moment. And what I really appreciated about and feel passionately about for my contribution to Calder is that it also added to this larger puzzle of Americans' contribution in this larger movement. I remember thinking about science and art and what was happening. There was so much talk about Paris, but not about the American voice and not about what was happening in the United States. And so I told you, like, a lot of these developments were coming out, like the telescope lens design, coming out of America. So I was like, how is that not? And so I really loved, like, understanding it. But what I appreciate most about Calder is that beyond all of it, I think there was something, I know we said he's not spiritual, but I think there was something about trying to understand the place we're in, trying to understand what is beyond the everyday, trying to understand the essential truth of it all. And that's, to me, very moving. And I see that in his work, and I see that in his writing, and that's what makes me really love him.
It's very wonderful. And then yes, exactly. If we have time for one last question, and this may be the trickiest of all questions, one of our audience members is wondering, well, if we think of Calder today, what makes him relevant? What are the ideas that really stand out in our contemporary moment, or is it a timeless aspect? So wanting to pick your brains on the importance of Calder today.
I'll go very quickly by saying just having us three here shows that there's so many dimensions to Calder and so many ways to appreciate his work. So I feel like the relevance of him is there's so many different ways you can love his work. And that's really rich. I don't think there's a lot of artists you can say that about.
Just leave it at that.
You don't want to say anything?
Is that going to be the last word? Beth may have a last word.
I teach a class on Calder every year. So I'm all about getting young people involved in engaging with his work. And I think the thing that is liberating and promising about Calder is the fact that he is not constrained. His imagination is not constrained by boundaries. He's all about connection, and he's all about awareness, and he's all about experience. And it's really incumbent upon the viewer that encounters his work. So that's why I was very interested in, okay, tell us about that gigantic stabile that is at Storm King, which is this phenomenal work that struck you immediately and made change your life. I tell my students, this artist can change your life, will change your life, has changed my life, but it has to do with his connection and his expectation for you to meet him halfway. Calder puts it out for the universe, but he also expects the universe to meet him halfway. I mean, there's something about that connection, that desire to connect, that I think inspires students. And so, I tell them, when you finish, you're going to be aware of the turning of the earth, and you're going to be aware of how this world, you're a part of this moving world.
I think that was excellent.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you so very much to everybody here. Thank you for coming, joining us today.